Decoding Decarbonization, where we dive into today's most relevant topics for decarbonization and discuss best practices for each step of the sustainability journey, from making the manufacturing floor greener, identifying decarbonization drivers, and moving beyond low-hanging decarbonization fruit. For today's podcast, Fundamental Pillars for Achieving Corporate Decarbonization Success, we have the pleasure of hosting Matt Helgeson, Head of Sustainability for Siemens US, sharing what we've learned about sustainability best practices along our journey to net zero. Matt, thank you so much for joining us on our podcast today, and it was great seeing you at Climate Week last week.
Hey, Stacey, thanks for having me. It was a great week.
Absolutely. And, we were immersed in an entire week of hearing all of the different challenges, barriers, but also tailwinds on getting to net zero and how organizations can do that. So maybe help us understand as head of sustainability for the US, when you're launching a sustainability program, what kinds of expectations should companies set on at the beginning of that journey?
Sure. So we heard a lot of this last week at Climate Week from companies who are getting into this journey and particularly into the execution phase of their decarbonization efforts. But I think in the long term, companies need to be ambitious. I think companies are capable of much more than maybe it seems at the outset. And for Siemens, we set our first carbon neutral target back in 2015. And we've evolved that target to now be a net zero in operational emissions by 2030 with a 90% physical emissions reduction requirement along the way. And so that sort of big, bold, ambitious target really set the stage for what are our expectations, what are our long-term expectations for the way we're going to do business. And then I think when you begin that, and if you start there, it's also really important to set specific interim targets to ensure that there is action in the near term, because what we've learned is that showing progress along the way really does ensure buy-in from the organization, from the leadership, and really allows for that flywheel of momentum around these activities and around the funding that's required to really pick up speed.
And that's a great point around building momentum, where you have really a portfolio of decarbonization levers at your disposal. Can you talk about how Siemens has built a program, number one, across a multitude of sources of emissions, but also in a way that is using different decarbonization levers to show that early progress?
It can be complicated, and I think that part of what's really important about those early conversations is to take the time to really understand your footprint, really understand your emission sources. And you can do that at the highest level and look at things like, your scope 1 and 2 emissions. And for us, that's a large vehicle fleet. That's our manufacturing and office building, our facility footprint. Of course, all of our energy consumption, electricity consumption associated with those facilities. And so once you can really understand that high level, where are our emission sources, getting into the details of what's required to decarbonize those emission sources can really give you the right kind of material to find the people in the organization who have the ability to act on those sources. And so part of that also becomes an organizational tool. And so for us, it was a way to bring in more than just the corporate sustainability office, right? So it was a way for us to engage the businesses who occupy these facilities and who create their products there into the conversation. It also allowed us to bring other corporate functions into the discussion, like our real estate group and our supply chain group and our fleet management group, because as we evaluated that footprint that we were up against addressing and decarbonizing, those kinds of groups could take ownership of certain parts of that and really kind of approach it in a programmatic way that allows it to be not only maybe more quickly addressed, but brings ownership of the overall program in a way that's hard to do if you don't truly understand where those emissions are coming from.
And you really hit on something that I want to dive into a little bit later around the culture of the organization really playing a key part. But maybe first, thinking about bringing those teams in and across a large footprint, the challenges and the methodology for activating those different groups and prioritizing facilities, office buildings versus manufacturing versus fleet. What are the challenges and how do you approach that?
So as we understood our footprint better and within the facility aspect of those emissions, the prioritization of facilities really comes down to two categories, right? The office buildings and the manufacturing facilities. The office buildings are a little more straightforward because the emission sources there are really driven by energy or electricity consumption. And so we know that there's solutions available, energy efficiency projects, lighting retrofits. There's a multitude of renewable energy purchasing options to address those emissions associated with that. There is, typically some natural gas when you talk about HVAC, but again, that equipment that's needed to electrify those sources is available and it's proven. When you look at the manufacturing footprint, it does get a little more complicated because, of course, in the manufacturing space, you're maintaining the quality of production process while potentially replacing equipment. A lot of that equipment uses, significant natural gas and has high heat. And so how do you maintain that consistency when you're talking about replacing equipment with something electrified? In addition to that, not all of that equipment is necessarily proven and available, and it's also possibly less economically viable in the near term. So using that as a guide for prioritizing our sites it was a way for us to understand what could be done first and really start to gain some of that momentum you talked about, Stacy. And I think as we looked at our facilities across the U.S., it became pretty clear pretty quickly that there were 5 or 6 sites that were the bulk of our U.S. emissions. So we put our businesses to work and did a full facility decarbonization assessment at those facilities to get even deeper into where are the emission sources in this particular facility. That allowed us to see, well, as we work within the business's typical annual planning process so that they can begin to budget for these things, what can be done first, what's available today. And that really pushed 2 or 3 facilities up on the list because we knew we could get to work sooner. And another important aspect of that, another tool in that process is the opportunity to apply digitalization and digital tools into this operational space. And so connecting those facilities, connecting the real world to the digital world, and making those industry and infrastructure assets like our facilities, in our case, come online and making them more intelligent really serves as a way to speed up that process. And so using digital tools allows us to just achieve net zero and decarbonization progress faster in the real world and in our operational space.
And you've really touched on the dynamics of how to do that prioritization and specifically doing so while continuing to run a business.
That's right.
So when you think about not only the dynamics of that process, but hurdles that those businesses are facing or that the program overall at the US level is facing, what can organizations that are just starting out on this journey, what can they anticipate and plan for?
Yeah, and I mentioned this budget question, and of course that's really at the forefront of that next phase. So as you understand your footprint, understand what it's going to take to decarbonize that footprint, you begin to put a cost associated with getting those projects underway. Any cost to the business, of course, is scrutinized and evaluated. The hurdle with understanding those implications is really more in how do we time this appropriately? How do we include these projects and the upfront costs that are associated with these projects in the typical business model or planning process of those businesses? And there is some good news there. So for us, it was the willingness to accept a slightly longer return period on these project investments. But if you can do that, you can really see overall cost savings in the long term, which, when you're talking about a manufacturing facility that you own, long term is a much easier thing to really prioritize, because that is the core of your business. And so that allows for that financial planning to be more acceptable to the businesses as you get into that. So I think that the hurdle of the cost associated with decarbonization, of course, is in front of any company who's looking to get to work here. But there are ways to get a little more creative within your typical budget process that allows the businesses to again kind of take ownership of that and to plan accordingly.
And let's maybe move, while we're on the topic of finances, into a place that might make this a little bit more palatable, thinking about the business opportunities that a decarbonization agenda or decarbonized facilities would present to a business. Have you seen any of those?
Absolutely. And I think Siemens is unique because our business is driving sustainability for our customers. And so the business case and the opportunities that present themselves from doing this work ourselves are pretty clear. Not every company is necessarily in the same boat, but I think what every company can see is that because this work is complicated and because no company can really get to something like a net zero target alone, and that, as we all recognize, is that our sustainability targets overlap, right? We share in a lot of these sustainability targets. Really interesting partnerships will result from that. And I think that because of the fact that every company's direct emissions are another company's or their customers' scope 3 or indirect emissions, your action on decarbonization can really be a differentiator in the market, a differentiator for you to your customers who are pursuing their own sustainability. So then it becomes an indirect way to gain competitive advantage, I think, in the long term, because markets are moving in that direction. I mean, but we see, Stacey, you see it with your customers asking things of us as a provider to them in terms of what we're doing. And so the expectation from customers and from markets is becoming pretty clear in that action here is going to be required in the long run. But if you're early to that, you can really differentiate your business.
Absolutely. And we are seeing that increasingly from our customers. So spot on there. Coming back to something you said towards the beginning, which is really the importance of bringing the entire organization along, getting the businesses involved. How do you build a culture to motivate employees to accept the changes that are happening as part of this program, or that's required to decarbonize, but also to get excited about it and contribute maybe things that you hadn't thought of before as you're executing the program?
It's really important, and it's something that we've kind of learned along the way. I think first and foremost, if your company is setting priorities in this space, the top-down communication of those priorities and the purpose behind those commitments is crucial. So leadership has to communicate well what they're committing the business and the company to, and why. And then make the business case for your employees. You can show those things that, like we just talked about, market differentiation, long-term cost savings, this idea of resilience for your company to continue to do well over the long term. So security there, things like brand value. I mean, making some quantitative distinctions there for employees is really important after you've kind of delivered that top-down priority message. And I think something else that we've done that's been really helpful is to make the topic accessible. So if you're not in this every day, and if you're in other functions within the company, or if you're in the business that's spending time externally with customers, it's hard to understand how it all connects. And so we've tried really hard to create things like webinar series and ask me anything type panels where we can connect the dots between this corporate sustainability commitment and programs into every job function, into every business, and how it impacts folks who aren't in it every day. And so we really like to say that at Siemens, every job is a climate job because of what we've set as our purpose and the commitments that we've made and the way our portfolio and what we bring to the market supports that. Whether you're in the legal department or supply chain or a salesperson, you're contributing to that purpose. And so that really we've gotten a lot of good feedback on how connecting those dots has really pulled the employees in.
That's a good perspective. You and I have the privilege of being in roles that are directly tied to what we're doing every day. But I think it's a point well made that truly in today's environment, every job is a climate job. So moving into, I think we close up our fiscal year here in the next couple days over at Siemens. Going into 2024, what are you most excited about?
Well, I think that there's been a significant shift for us from this phase of target setting and commitment definitions and into action. And within that decarbonization space and some of the categories that we've talked about, we have programs in place that are now working, I'll say, almost in the background as if they've always been there in things like fleet electrification, in the facility evaluation and decarb that we talked a little bit about. Those programs are in place and they include the appropriate functions and organizations within the company to really get to work. And so I think the moment that we're in here internally with our own decarbonization work is exciting because we're going to really see projects at facilities. We're going to see EVs on the road. We're going to see these things come to life. And I think that will not only begin to show real progress, but also gain even more momentum from the employees and the company as a whole. I think the market also is having a moment. And so I'm really excited about the way that our sustainability functions are working with the businesses to really help bring what they do well to this growing and massive decarbonization-driven, sustainability-driven market that our businesses can serve, and particularly here in the U.S. There's a huge opportunity coming through with things like the IRA, and where funding becomes available to companies that may not have had the opportunity or the capital to really get engaged are now becoming engaged. So the market opportunity is really exciting as well, and that only gets bolstered by the work that we're doing for ourselves.
Well said, and a great note to end on. I think we heard a lot of that during Climate Week as well, that tipping point and that true optimism around, while we may not be as a global economy where we need to be quite yet, that within organizations, we're really feeling that momentum. I know within Siemens, we're feeling that enthusiasm and that shift to truly operationalizing this plan. So really appreciate your perspective on all of the consideration, all of the work that it takes to get there, and truly enjoy working with you in that space. This was really great. Thank you, Matt, for a great launch to our Decoding Decarbonization podcast series.
Well, thanks for having me, Stacey. It's always great to talk with you, and I'm looking forward to listening to the rest of the series.
And to our listeners out there, to continue with us on this journey, subscribe to the Siemens Decoding Decarbonization podcast series on your favorite podcast platform. In the next episode, we're going to go a little bit deeper with the U.S. manufacturing footprint, looking at some of the challenges to retrofit brownfield facilities, as well as considerations when thinking about greenfield facilities, and how to build that decarbonization plan into your overall business strategy. We look forward to talking to you then.